The desert sun was already high when the black limousine crossed the golden gates of Zahara's royal palace. From the back seat, Isabella Montenegro, just 22 years old, stared out the tinted window in silence, her green eyes scanning the palace towers that rose like spears into the blazing sky. Her blonde hair, glowing like fine threads of sunlight, was pulled back neatly as if that could somehow hold together the nervous storm building in her chest. There was something surreal about everything. The ornate entrance, the soldiers in traditional robes standing guard, the whispering palms bending under the desert wind. "We've arrived, miss," the driver said in flawless English, but his words seemed to come from far away. Isabella adjusted the white dress that clung to her like a final layer of innocence. Her mother had picked it, saying it represented purity, hope, and worth, the worth she now carried into this arrangement that had become her future. Just 3 months earlier, her life had been painfully ordinary, but the collapse of her father's company had brought a storm that swept away any illusion of choice. Now here she was, on the other side of the world, about to meet a man who had essentially bought her as part of a high-stakes deal dressed up as marriage. She stepped out, her heels sinking slightly into the stone path as palace staff materialized to guide her. The silence around her was strange, not empty but dense, filled with eyes that watched and lips that didn't speak. Marble fountains whispered nearby, surrounded by jasmine blooming under the merciless sun. Every detail was too perfect, too curated, like the setting for a play she wasn't ready to perform in. Inside the palace, she was led through a maze of hallways, each more elaborately decorated than the last. Her fingers grazed the cool walls as she walked, Persian rugs underfoot, crystal chandeliers overhead. "His Highness is waiting in the lily garden," one of the attendants said quietly, gesturing to an arched doorway. Isabella felt the weight of every step as she approached the garden. She had never met him, not even a photo. And yet, in minutes, she would face the man who owned her future. As she stepped under the arch, she saw him. Khalil al-Rashid stood with his back to her, gazing into a fountain where lilies floated like stars. Even from behind, he radiated presence. When he turned, time stuttered. His features were striking, deep-set eyes as blue as midnight oceans, sun-kissed skin, and a jawline that looked carved from stone. Isabella's breath caught. In that single moment, she realized this was not just another player in her father's game. This was a man who could unravel her. Khalil's voice wrapped around her like warm silk when he finally spoke her name. Isabella Montenegro. It wasn't the first time someone had said it, but it felt different coming from him. There was a gravity in his tone, a quiet command beneath the softness. Isabella instinctively dipped into a curtsy, clumsy and unsure, her hands trembling at her sides. "Your Highness," she murmured. "Khalil," he corrected gently, stepping forward with the calm confidence of someone used to controlling a room. "Soon we'll be husband and wife. Formalities won't be necessary." She managed a small nod, but her pulse was racing. She hadn't expected this. His beauty, yes, but not the intelligence in his eyes, or the way he looked at her like she was more than a pawn in a transaction. Over the next few days, everything blurred. Preparations consumed her schedule: fittings, etiquette lessons, briefings on Zahara's traditions, and political expectations. She was moved into the palace's women's quarters, a serene space where every inch whispered of control. She met Amira, the court advisor assigned to her, who explained the truth behind the marriage with unflinching honesty. "This union is about more than love or compatibility," Amira had said. "His Highness must secure his position. You represent legitimacy. You are a bridge between cultures, and an answer to those who doubt him." The words echoed in her mind as she tried to sleep each night, her thoughts tangled with anxiety and dreams she didn't understand. But Khalil wasn't just a symbol of power. When they met for formal walks through the palace gardens or shared carefully arranged dinners, there were cracks in the surface, fleeting moments where he seemed real. He spoke with fluency and warmth, not only in English but in 5 other languages, switching between them with ease. Isabella found herself drawn to the way he listened, how he asked questions not just out of politeness but genuine curiosity. He was sharp, strategic, and calm under pressure, a natural leader. But there was something else beneath all that, something that flickered when their hands brushed, or when he lingered too long on her smile. A silent current. Isabella didn't want to believe she was imagining it. One afternoon, as they strolled near the rose garden, he looked at her and asked, "Are you afraid of me?" The question caught her off guard. "I'm afraid of the unknown," she admitted. He nodded, his gaze lingering. "And I am unknown to you." His words weren't accusatory. They were observant, reflective. For the first time since arriving, Isabella didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like a woman teetering at the edge of something much deeper than a royal duty, something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for. With each passing day, the image Isabella had built of Khalil as a calculated ruler began to fracture. Yes, he was powerful, and yes, there was a clear political strategy behind everything, including their marriage, but there was also humanity in him. During one lesson in Zaharan traditions, she saw him quietly approach an elderly gardener and help him lift a heavy pot, speaking to him with the same respect he used with ministers. Later, she learned that Khalil had studied in Oxford, held degrees in international relations and economics, and was fluent not just in languages, but in the complexities of global diplomacy. Still, these facts paled next to the subtler details: the way he tilted his head when listening, the way his eyes flicked to her whenever she smiled. Every interaction carried a tension that Isabella didn't know how to name. It wasn't fear, it was something hotter, something dangerous. She caught herself watching the way his shirt clung to his shoulders, the way his voice dipped when they were alone. And yet, nothing happened. Not a single gesture beyond the boundaries of protocol. It drove her mad. If this was all an arrangement, why did he look at her like he wanted more? Why did it feel like she was living two parallel lives? One as the future Sheikah, and another as a woman slowly unraveling under the weight of attraction. 2 weeks before the wedding, everything shifted. It was an ordinary afternoon. She had wandered into one of the lesser-used gardens, hoping to find quiet. But then she heard voices, Khalil and someone else speaking in Arabic. The voice of the other man was sharp, low. Omar, Khalil's closest advisor. Isabella had picked up enough of the language to follow bits and pieces, and what she heard chilled her. "The northern tribes are rallying against you," Omar said. "They say a sheik who marries a foreigner for convenience is not worthy of the throne." Khalil's response came like steel. "Let them talk. This marriage gives me what I need, political stability and a pure heir." The words sliced through her. Pure heir. Political stability. She was a contract, not a person. A role, not a partner. Isabella stood frozen, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and humiliation. She had let herself believe, even just a little, that maybe he saw her, really saw her, that maybe the tension between them was mutual. But now it all felt like a cruel game. That night, she didn't come down for dinner. She stayed in her room and cried, not like a girl overwhelmed, but like a woman who realized she'd let herself feel something in a place where feelings were currency, not connection. 2 days passed. Isabella barely left her room. She went through the motions, lessons, meals, fittings, but she floated above them all, numb. Her heart, which had once fluttered in Khalil's presence, now beat with dull resignation. The palace suddenly felt smaller, more suffocating, like a beautiful prison gilded in deception. That's why, when she heard the knock on her chamber door late one evening, she almost didn't respond. But something in the quiet intensity of the moment made her move. She opened it to find Khalil standing there alone. No guards, no advisors, no formal robes. He wore a simple white shirt and dark pants, his collar open, hair slightly tousled. He looked less like a prince and more like a man who hadn't slept. "May I come in?" he asked, voice gentle, unsure. She stepped aside and he entered, closing the door behind him. There was a silence between them, thick with unspoken things. "You've been distant," he said softly, not accusing, just observing. Isabella kept her eyes down. "No, Your Highness." "Isabella," he said, stepping closer. "Look at me." When she finally raised her gaze, his expression shifted. He could see her pain. "I heard you," she whispered. "In the garden. You called me a tool for stability. You talked about heirs, like I'm just a function." His face tensed at her words, the weight of them clearly landing. He didn't deny it, not right away. Instead, he looked away, exhaled, then turned back with something new in his eyes. Regret. "You're right," he said. "When this arrangement began, it was just that, an arrangement. I needed a wife. Your father needed salvation. It was simple." Isabella's throat tightened. She nodded as if confirming what she already knew. But Khalil stepped closer. "But then you arrived," he said, "and everything changed." The room felt charged. You're not what I expected. I thought I'd be marrying a spoiled girl, someone easy to manipulate. But you're brave. You gave up everything for your family. You've adapted. You've shown respect to everyone here. And you've challenged me in ways I never anticipated." He paused, searching her face. "You make me question what I want, not just politically, but personally." The tears that had been sitting quietly behind her eyes finally fell. "So what am I to you now?" she asked, voice raw. Khalil stepped forward, cupping her face with both hands. "You're the first person who's made me feel anything real in a long time." Before she could process it, his lips met hers. The kiss was cautious at first, as if he feared she'd pull away. But she didn't. The truth was, despite everything, her body still responded to him with a kind of gravity she couldn't resist. When they finally pulled apart, neither spoke. But something unspoken had changed between them, something that couldn't be reversed. The next morning, everything was different, and yet nothing had changed. Isabella woke alone in her bed, the morning sun casting long golden lines across the tiled floor. The memory of Khalil's kiss still clung to her lips like a secret. They hadn't gone further. He hadn't crossed any boundary, but in that quiet electric exchange, something in her had shifted. For the first time, she had allowed herself to want him, not because it was expected, but because it was undeniable. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the carved patterns on the wall, trying to make sense of what that moment meant. Was it real? Or just another part of his strategy to keep her in place until the crown was secured? Her mind wanted to be cautious, but her heart, her stubborn, irrational heart, was already 10 steps ahead, dreaming of impossible things. She had seen the way his eyes softened. She had felt the tremble in his hands. That wasn't politics. That was something else. Still, she couldn't ignore the facts. This marriage was born out of desperation. She was the price of a bailout, no matter how tender his voice or how sincere his touch. She needed to be smart, needed to protect herself, but the lines between survival and surrender were blurring quickly. As if summoned by her thoughts, Khalil appeared later that afternoon with a calm urgency that unsettled her. His expression was different, no longer the prince with carefully measured smiles and strategic silences. He looked like a man carrying the weight of too many decisions. "We need to talk," he said. She nodded, bracing herself. They walked together through the side corridors of the palace until they reached one of the private terraces that overlooked the dunes. The heat of the desert was thick and still, like the air before a storm. Khalil leaned on the railing, silent for a long time before finally speaking. "There's been a leak," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Someone in my council shared details of the financial agreement with your father. The tribes know." Isabella's stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" she asked, already fearing the answer. "It means they're accusing me of buying my way into legitimacy. They're calling the marriage a farce. And worse, they're threatening civil war if it proceeds." She felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "So, what happens now?" He turned to her, his voice lower now. "They've given me an ultimatum. Cancel the wedding, or risk everything." The desert stretched endlessly before them, golden and merciless. For the first time since arriving in Zahara, Isabella didn't feel afraid. She felt resolute. "Then you need to send me home," she said, "before they burn this place to the ground." Khalil didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, really looked at her with a kind of desperation that made her chest ache. "No," he said finally, his voice rough. "You're not just someone I can send away like a diplomatic package. Not now." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, his hands landing on her shoulders, firm but gentle. "I know what this looks like, Isabella. I know how much I've asked of you. But I swear to you, what I feel now has nothing to do with politics." She shook her head, her throat tightening. "You have an entire kingdom on the line. And what is a kingdom without peace? Without love?" He shot back. His intensity startled her. "I spent years thinking I could control everything. People, tradition, power. But you were the one thing I never anticipated. And now that I have you, the thought of losing you feels worse than losing my crown." His words were sincere, raw, but she didn't let them wash over her blindly. She had to be careful. She had to be sure. "Khalil, we can't win both battles," she said, voice shaking. "You can't keep me and keep the throne. Not if your people believe you betrayed them." He stepped back slightly, jaw clenched, the weight of his role crashing down on him again. "Then we'll find another way," There has to be a way. She watched him pace the terrace like a lion trapped in his own palace. The fire in his eyes was no longer about strategy. It was survival. Not just his, but hers. Maybe even theirs. If I go, she whispered, they'll calm down. They'll believe you sacrificed the alliance. You can regroup, reclaim their trust. The words cut her like glass, but she said them anyway, because she believed them to be true. Khalil turned, his face a storm of resistance and sorrow. And what about you? Where will you go? Back to Brazil, she said. I'll rebuild my life, quietly, without shame. The thought of leaving him, of pretending that their moments meant nothing, was unbearable. But it was the logical path. He approached her again, slower this time, like every step pained him. And if I let you go, if I lose you, do I ever get another chance? She blinked through the tears burning in her eyes. I don't know. Maybe not. But that's what love is sometimes, isn't it? Doing what's right, even if it means letting go. Khalil looked like he'd been punched in the chest. He wrapped his arms around her then, holding her like she was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. She didn't cry. Not yet. She just let herself be held, knowing the moment she stepped away, it might be the last time. That night, Isabella sat on the balcony of her chambers, wrapped in a thin silk shawl, staring out at the endless dunes. The stars over Zahara were impossibly bright, scattered like shards of glass across the inky sky. She hadn't slept. There was no point in pretending she could. Her thoughts moved in circles, each one returning to Khalil's face, his voice, the feel of his arms around her. She had come here believing she was being sacrificed, traded like a valuable object to settle a debt. But somehow, between the rituals and the silences, she had found something more than survival. She had found a reason to want more, and that terrified her. Because now, letting go wasn't just about dignity. It was about tearing away something that had become part of her. She picked up the pen and the paper she'd brought from her desk earlier, her hands trembling as she began to write. A letter to her parents, explaining what had happened. A note to Khalil, in case he needed to show proof of her decision to leave. And one to herself, because part of surviving this would be remembering who she was before all this began. She wrote slowly, methodically, as if the act of putting her pain into words might somehow soften it. Just before dawn, a soft knock startled her. She turned, half expecting a servant, but it was him, Khalil. He stepped inside without waiting for permission, his hair disheveled, eyes bloodshot but burning with resolve. "You're leaving," he said. Not a question, just a fact he hated acknowledging. "I was," she replied quietly, "but something tells me you're about to stop me." He stepped closer, holding something in his hand. Documents, sealed and marked with the royal crest. "I spent the night with my advisors," he said. "I told them I would not cancel the wedding. I told them I would step down if necessary." Isabella's heart stopped. "What? I'm choosing you, Isabella, even if it means giving up the throne. I'm not going to rule over a country that demands I abandon the woman I love. That's not leadership. That's cowardice." Her breath hitched, the words tumbling through her like a wave she hadn't seen coming. "But your people, your legacy, there's no legacy worth building if it's built on lies and loss," he said. "I have a plan, one that might not save everything, but it might give us a chance." He looked at her like she was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. "But I need you to trust me." Isabella stood in silence, staring at the man who was no longer just a prince or a political gamble. He was something infinitely rarer, a man willing to risk it all for love. Isabella didn't answer right away. She stared at Khalil as if seeing him for the first time. Not the heir to Zahara's throne, not the architect of a politically convenient marriage, but the man underneath all that, the one who had just handed her his future like a fragile offering. "What exactly is the plan?" she asked, voice steady despite the chaos inside her. Khalil's expression shifted into something sharper, more focused. "We're going to reframe the narrative," he said. "You and I will address the people directly. Not from a podium, not as royalty, just as two people who made a choice. Imperfect, maybe even controversial, but real." Isabella's brow furrowed. "You want to go public?" "We need to," he replied. "Let them see who you are. Let them understand that this isn't about power. It's about what happens when the old rules stop making sense and something better tries to take root." His words stirred something in her, a flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, they weren't completely trapped. "And if they don't accept it?" she asked. Then we walk away, he said without hesitation. We leave Zahara. I'll find another way to rebuild, but I won't do it without you. That final sentence undid her. Isabella closed the distance between them and took his hand. Then I'm with you, she said. All in, whatever comes. By midday, the entire palace was buzzing. Whispers turned into speculation, and speculation into disbelief. No one, especially not the council, had expected Khalil to move so boldly. But within hours, a private broadcast had been arranged. The press was excluded. This wasn't for international cameras or royal spectacle. This was for the people of Zahara. The palace's grand garden became the stage. Khalil wore traditional attire, but Isabella stood beside him in a modest cream-colored dress that symbolized unity, not wealth. No crown, no jewels, just truth. Khalil spoke first, addressing the camera with poise but none of the usual diplomatic detachment. He explained how the marriage had begun, yes, as an arrangement, but how something deeper had taken hold. He confessed to miscalculations, to the arrogance of trying to engineer loyalty through politics. And then he looked at Isabella. This woman, he said, has shown me more strength, compassion, and courage than any title ever could. I love her, and I will not build a future without her. The vulnerability in his voice rang like thunder across the silence. When it was Isabella's turn, her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke from the heart. I came here afraid, feeling like a pawn, but I stayed because I found someone worth fighting for. And even if you can't accept us now, I hope one day you'll understand what we tried to do. That was it. No royal declarations, no rehearsed speeches, just raw honesty. The days that followed were unlike anything Isabella could have imagined. Zahara held its breath. The initial backlash was swift and loud. Conservative factions condemned the broadcast, accusing Khalil of weakening the monarchy and breaking tradition. Protesters gathered outside the palace gates holding banners that read, "Honor before emotion," and "A kingdom is not a love story." But just as quickly, another wave began to swell, one quieter but no less powerful. Messages flooded in from citizens who had watched the broadcast and felt something shift. Young people in particular resonated with the honesty. They saw a leader who was willing to be vulnerable, to step away from polished control and speak with the heart of a human being. More importantly, they saw Isabella not as a foreign invader, but as a woman who had been transparent about her fear, her sacrifice, and her love. It wasn't a landslide of approval, but it was a start. The palace's social media team began receiving thousands of supportive comments, some from unexpected places. Even elders from rival tribes sent letters, not endorsing the union, but recognizing the bravery it took to lay everything bare. Khalil didn't celebrate. He stayed measured, cautious. The tide can shift again, he told Isabella one night as they walked the palace corridors. But for the first time, I feel like we're not drowning. Still, danger remained. Certain factions, particularly the powerful Northern Tribal Alliance, refused to soften. They demanded formal arbitration, threatening to dissolve the council if the marriage proceeded. Khalil called for a meeting, one that would bring all tribal leaders to the capital for the first time in years. It was a risk. This could go either way, Omar warned him. They may come with demands, or they may come with weapons. But Khalil was firm. Then let them come. Isabella spent those days on edge, helping where she could, preparing for outcomes she couldn't predict. Khalil refused to let her be kept in the shadows. If they're going to decide our fate, they'll look you in the eye when they do it, he said. She stood beside him when the council convened. 30 men and women from every corner of Zahara, robed in centuries of tradition. The air was thick with tension. Khalil didn't posture. He didn't bow. He simply stood tall and told the truth again, about the arrangement, the unexpected love that grew, and the need to reshape a future that honored both legacy and progress. Then he stepped aside, letting Isabella speak. She shared what it meant to come from a broken place, to find unexpected dignity in unfamiliar soil. Some scoffed, others listened. A few lowered their eyes, not in judgment, but in understanding. When it was over, there was no applause, just silence. A silence so heavy it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. A full day passed before any reply came from the assembled tribal leaders. When it did, it arrived on parchment sealed with the crimson wax of the Northern Alliance, an emblem that carried as much threat as authority. Khalil broke the seal with steady hands, but Isabella saw his knuckles whiten. The letter was succinct. The leaders would convene again at dusk, not for another debate, but for a vote, an unprecedented public decision on whether the royal marriage could proceed. The city braced itself. Markets closed early, and families gathered around radios and screens, waiting for news that might define the nation's next era. Isabella stood beside Khalil on a balcony overlooking the royal square. Below, citizens filled the expanse until it looked like a living ocean, restless and electric. What struck her was the mix of faces, old and young, men in traditional keffiyehs, and women in modern jeans. Zahara in all its contradictions. Some held signs in support, others bore expressions too complicated to read. Whatever they decide, Khalil whispered, his fingers brushing hers, remember that we walked into this together. She nodded, absorbing the weight of that promise. When the tribal leaders finally emerged onto the raised dais in the square's center, a hush rippled through the crowd. Isabella's pulse thundered in her ears. Omar stepped forward to read the verdict, but his posture alone told nothing. The suspense was unbearable, stretching the seconds into a lifetime, until Omar's voice carried through the amplifiers, calm but resonant, announcing the council's decision. The words felt surreal. The council recognizes the legitimacy of the union between Khalil al-Rashid and Isabella Montenegro. A collective gasp swept through the square, followed by a wave of reactions, cheers from supporters, stunned silence from skeptics, a cacophony that blurred into one vast sound of transformation. Up on the balcony, Isabella felt her knees weaken. Khalil's hand tightened around hers, grounding her as tears threatened to spill. Omar continued explaining the terms. The marriage could stand, but with stipulations ensuring transparency in royal finances and a renewed commitment to tribal representation in governance. It was a compromise, less power for Khalil in the short term, but a potentially stronger foundation for Zahara's future. He accepted without hesitation, delivering brief remarks that blended gratitude with resolve, promising a reign rooted in accountability and unity. Isabella watched him speak, light from the setting sun igniting the square in gold, and realized this was the moment everything changed, not just for the nation, but for them. They hadn't merely survived, they'd rewritten the rules, and though challenges lay ahead, the path was now theirs to walk side by side, not as strangers bound by duty, but as partners forged by choice and tested by a kingdom's glare. That night, the palace didn't erupt in a celebration. There were no parades, no fireworks. Instead, there was something more powerful: quiet solidarity. People stayed in the streets, lighting candles and placing them on windowsills and palace gates, not as an act of protest or allegiance, but of reflection. Zahara was changing, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. Inside the palace, Isabella and Khalil walked through the garden where they had first met. No advisors, no cameras, just the hum of jasmine and the whisper of fountains. "Do you think we did the right thing?" she asked, her fingers brushing over a lily petal. Khalil looked at her, the same way he had that very first time, like he was seeing something rare. "I think we did the only thing we could live with," he said. And it was true. Their love hadn't started the way fairy tales do. It had been born out of desperation, molded by politics, tested by suspicion. But what survived that crucible wasn't fragile. It was forged. "There's still so much to face," she murmured. "I know," he replied, taking her hand. "But now we face it together." She didn't realize she was crying until he gently wiped a tear from her cheek. There were no more masks between them, no more roles to perform, just the slow, steady rise of something real. In the days that followed, preparations for the wedding resumed, but not in the way they had been planned before. Gone were the lavish ceremonies orchestrated by tradition and control. In their place was something smaller, more intimate. The council insisted on cultural rituals being preserved, but this time Isabella had a voice in every detail. Her dress was designed locally, modest yet elegant, with Zaharan embroidery sewn into the hem, a tribute to the people she now called her own. The guest list was trimmed, not by class or influence, but by connection. People who had stood by them. People who mattered. On the morning of the wedding, Isabella stood before the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked different, though she did, but because she felt different. She was no longer the girl who had arrived in Zahara afraid and voiceless. She was someone who had fought for her place, for her love, and for her right to be more than a symbol. As she stepped into the garden where they would exchange vows, a hush fell over the crowd. Khalil was already waiting, dressed in traditional white, his expression unreadable until their eyes met. Then he smiled, a smile that held no trace of politics, no hint of performance, just love. And in that moment, under the same desert sun that had once made her feel like a captive, Isabella knew she was finally home. The ceremony itself was unlike anything Zahara had seen in generations. No grand military parades or royal fanfare. No scripted speeches delivered from ivory balconies. Instead, Khalil and Isabella stood beneath a modest arch made of woven palm fronds and white lilies, surrounded by people, not spectators but witnesses. Friends, palace workers, advisors, even members of the press stood shoulder to shoulder with tribal elders and townspeople. It was symbolic of everything they had fought for: unity in imperfection, truth over appearance. Khalil's vows were simple, spoken in both Arabic and English. I offer you not a kingdom, but a life, where we choose each other, even when it's hard. Isabella's voice trembled as she responded. I came here believing I was being traded, but I found something no one could have promised: freedom in the shape of you. There were no orchestras, just a small group of local musicians playing softly on traditional instruments. When the ceremony ended, they didn't release doves or ignite fireworks. Instead, children from nearby villages handed out olive branches to guests, symbols of peace, growth, and new beginnings. It wasn't opulent, but it was unforgettable. And when Khalil took her hand and led her through the crowd afterward, it wasn't as a prince showing off his bride. It was as a man walking beside his equal. Later that night, long after the guests had gone and the music had faded into memory, Isabella stood barefoot on the same balcony where she had written her goodbye letter weeks earlier. Now there was no letter in her hand, just a glass of spiced tea and a view of the kingdom she had once feared. Khalil joined her quietly, wrapping an arm around her waist as they looked out over the starlit dunes. You know, she whispered, I used to think I had to lose myself to survive this place. Khalil didn't speak, but she felt him listening. But somehow, by refusing to disappear, I found who I really was. He kissed the top of her head, drawing her closer. That's what you've given this country too, he said. Not just a queen, a mirror, a reminder that we can grow without forgetting who we are. It struck her then, how far they had both come, from strangers bound by necessity to partners in a story neither of them had seen coming. The road ahead was still full of uncertainty. There would be political fights, cultural challenges, resistance from those who clung to old ways. But there was also a bond between them that no storm had broken. And in that, there was strength. Not the kind taught in royal courts, but the kind carved out by fire, tested in truth and chosen, again and again, by choice. In the weeks that followed, Zahara began to change, not in sweeping revolutions, but in the quiet shift of conversation and the slow dismantling of outdated norms. It wasn't just about Khalil and Isabella anymore. Their story had become a symbol, a spark that ignited deeper questions. People began speaking openly in markets and mosques, in classrooms and courtrooms, about what it meant to honor tradition without becoming enslaved to it, about the role of women in leadership, about foreign influence and identity, about love, real, complicated, disruptive love, and whether it could coexist with duty. Isabella received hundreds of letters, many from young women, saying her strength gave them hope, not because she had won a crown, but because she had stood her ground. She read each one with a mixture of humility and disbelief, still unsure whether she truly deserved the praise. In truth, she was just trying to breathe through each day, learning to navigate a world that had once tried to swallow her whole. Her role as Sheikah was not ceremonial. She sat in on council meetings, proposed initiatives for education, and quietly pushed for reforms to protect vulnerable girls from forced marriages. Her presence alone caused waves, but her ideas were harder to dismiss. Khalil backed her in public and in private, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. She wasn't his accessory. She was his partner. But even as Zahara shifted forward, shadows lingered. Not everyone was ready to embrace the new narrative. There were whispers, some subtle, others threatening. Former allies of Khalil who had lost influence because of the marriage began to mobilize again. this time through bureaucratic obstacles and backroom sabotage. One night, during a diplomatic dinner with foreign dignitaries, a veiled insult toward Isabella's lineage sparked a tense moment. Khalil handled it with grace, but afterward, in their private quarters, she saw the exhaustion in his eyes. "They still see me as an outsider," she said. "No matter what I do." Khalil didn't argue. He didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, he pulled her gently into his arms and whispered, "Then we keep showing them. Not for them, for the ones watching in silence, waiting for a reason to believe it's possible." That became their unspoken mission, not to convince the old guard, but to light the path for whoever came next. Still, some nights, Isabella couldn't sleep. She'd stare at the ornate ceiling and wonder if they were just pretending. If the peace they had earned was temporary, if one day it would all unravel. But then Khalil would reach for her hand in the dark, squeeze it once, just enough to remind her they were still fighting. And that was enough. As time passed, Isabella found herself becoming part of Zahara in ways she never expected. She began learning the language more fluently, not just through tutors, but by speaking with palace staff, shopkeepers, and elders in the city. She adopted local customs not out of obligation, but out of a desire to truly belong. She wore traditional garments with reverence, cooked dishes with palace chefs, and sat with women in villages listening to their stories. Slowly, she stopped being the foreign bride and became simply Isabella, still different, still marked by her origins, but accepted in ways that mattered. The change wasn't sudden, it wasn't loud, but it was real. Children waved when they saw her. Merchants offered her the first fruits of the day. And when she walked through the capital alone, something unthinkable for a queen just months earlier, people bowed with respect, not out of fear, but from admiration. Khalil noticed it too. "You're becoming the heart of this place," he said one night as they sat on the palace rooftop. "You've given it something no law ever could." She smiled, but there was still a sliver of hesitation inside her. Belonging, after all, was fragile. One headline, one political misstep, and everything could turn. But she was learning to live with that uncertainty. She had found her voice, and she would use it, no matter the risk. It was during a late summer festival in the outer provinces that everything came full circle. Khalil and Isabella were invited to attend the Moonfire celebration, a tradition that honored both harvest and heritage. They traveled without a full royal escort, choosing to go quietly, with only a few guards and trusted aides. The celebration was breathtaking. Fire dancers moving through narrow streets, drums echoing off sandstone walls, families dressed in vibrant colors. But it was in a quiet courtyard, beneath a canopy of lanterns, that an elderly woman approached Isabella. She held out a small embroidered cloth and pressed it into Isabella's hands. "For your first daughter," she said in accented Portuguese, surprising her. "From a Zaharan mother who once feared you, but now prays for you." The gesture brought tears to Isabella's eyes. It wasn't about politics or ceremony. It was about connection, healing, proof that even centuries of tradition could soften when met with humanity. Khalil stood beside her, watching the exchange in silence, his hand brushing lightly against hers. Later that night, as they rode back to the palace in silence, Isabella clutched the cloth in her lap, her thoughts swirling. For the first time since this journey began, she wasn't just surviving. She was part of something sacred, something growing. And as she looked at Khalil, she realized it wasn't just his love that had changed her. It was his belief that she was worthy of being more than anyone had expected. Months rolled into a year, and the fire that had once threatened to destroy Khalil's reign gradually transformed into a quiet, steady light that illuminated a new chapter for Zahara. Isabella no longer marked time by council meetings or ceremonial obligations, but by the people she had come to know and the stories she now carried with her. One morning, as she sat beneath the same lily-covered arch where she had first seen Khalil, a servant approached with a sealed letter. It was from the Northern Council, not a threat, not a challenge, but a request. They wanted her to visit one of their provinces, to meet with the women of their community, to speak, not as royalty, but as someone who had once been an outsider. Isabella read the words twice, then folded the letter slowly, her fingers trembling. It was an invitation born not from duty, but from respect. When she showed it to Khalil, he simply smiled. "I told you they'd see you eventually," he said. She laughed softly, still disbelieving, but grateful. As the palace prepared for the trip, she felt a deep calm settle into her bones. Not peace in the sense of comfort or ease, but the kind of peace that comes after choosing to stand in the fire and learning you can survive it. She had come to Zahara as a sacrifice. She remained by choice. On the night before their departure to the Northern Territories, Isabella stood once again on the palace balcony, the air warm and still around her. She watched as the lights of the city flickered like a living constellation, each glow a life, a home, a future being shaped in real time. Khalil joined her without a word, wrapping his arms around her waist as they leaned into the silence. "You remember when I almost left?" she whispered. He nodded against her hair. "I think about it all the time," he said. "How close I came to losing everything I didn't even know I needed." She turned to face him, her hands resting on his chest. "Sometimes I wonder if we'd still be here if it hadn't all gone so wrong first." Khalil smiled, the kind that only ever belonged to her. Maybe the wrong was the only way to find what was right. In that quiet, suspended moment, they didn't need titles or reassurance. They had each other. And through each choice, each battle, each act of defiance in the name of love, they had built something unshakable. Not a perfect kingdom, not a flawless legacy, but a life, a partnership, a future that neither of them could have imagined, and one they would continue to write, hand in hand, day by day. The journey to the northern provinces marked a turning point not just for Isabella, but for Zahara itself. What had started as a tense, almost symbolic visit turned into a series of deeply human moments. In village after village, women gathered to meet her, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. They asked questions, shared stories, and listened to hers. Many had feared her at first, suspicious of her foreign roots and sudden place in their history. But when she sat among them, not above them, something changed. She didn't lecture. She didn't wear a crown. She told the truth about what it felt like to be used, to be afraid, to be seen as a transaction, and about how she found strength not in power, but in reclaiming her voice. The women nodded. Some even wept. And slowly, Isabella became more than a royal wife. She became a mirror. By the end of the trip, elders who had once dismissed her asked her to speak at council gatherings. Young girls shyly handed her hand-drawn portraits and flowers. Isabella didn't just survive the journey, she bloomed in it. And when she and Khalil returned to the palace, they were welcomed not with fanfare, but with quiet respect. The kind that couldn't be bought or forced. The kind that was earned. Life didn't become easy. There were still days when headlines cut like knives, when political maneuverings left her drained. But through every challenge, Khalil stood beside her, not as her protector, but as her equal. They fought often, disagreed about policies and approaches, but never about what mattered most: each other. Their love, once born from chaos, had matured into something real, unshakable, tested by everything the world could throw at it. And it was through this love that Zahara itself began to shift. Policies changed, education access widened, cultural reform slowly took root, not erasing the past, but reinterpreting it with compassion. Isabella often thought about the girl she used to be, the one who had sat in a limousine, dressed in white, trembling at the gates of a foreign palace. She had thought she was walking into a trap. Instead, she had stepped into the greatest transformation of her life. And as she looked around her now, at a kingdom still learning, still growing, she felt proud, not because she had conquered it, but because she had become part of it. And it had changed her just as much as she had changed it. Years later, long after the fire of controversy had faded into the history books, Isabella stood once again in the lily garden. This time she wasn't alone in her thoughts. A small child ran ahead of her, giggling as she chased a butterfly across the grass. Her daughter, Amina. Khalil followed behind, a little slower, watching with a look that blended pride, joy, and a quiet disbelief that this was their life now. Isabella knelt down, scooping Amina into her arms as the little girl squealed. "Mama, the flower followed me!" she cried. Isabella laughed, pressing a kiss to her daughter's sun-warmed cheek. Maybe it just knew where the joy was. Khalil wrapped his arms around them both, and for a moment, there was no palace, no throne, no politics. Just three people in a garden that had once been the site of so much uncertainty. It was there that their story had begun, and it was there it continued, in ways no one had predicted. Later that evening, Khalil and Isabella watched the sunset from the same terrace where they had once faced impossible choices. The light bathed the dunes in gold, casting long shadows across a kingdom forever marked by change. "Do you still think about it?" Khalil asked. "The early days?" Isabella smiled. "Sometimes it feels like another life, but sometimes it feels like yesterday." He nodded. "I still remember the moment I almost told you to run." She turned to him. "Why didn't you?" He paused, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Because you were the first person who made me want to stay." They didn't need to say more. The silence between them was full, rich, earned. When they returned to the palace that night, Isabella found an old box tucked away in one of her drawers. Inside was the letter she had started writing the day she almost left Zahara, the letter she never finished. She sat down with it, her hands trembling slightly, and read the words she'd once written with tears in her eyes. It was a goodbye she never sent, a version of herself she had outgrown. She didn't throw it away. She folded it gently and placed it in a new envelope, sealing it with wax. On the outside, she wrote a single word: "Remember." It wasn't for her anymore. It was for the woman she might one day become again. Unsure, afraid, at a crossroads. Proof that she had once survived the impossible and turned it into something beautiful. And if you're still reading this, if you've made it this far, maybe you needed to hear this too. That sometimes, the story you think is the end is actually just the start. That love, when it's real, when it's fought for, can change not just lives, but legacies. Isabella Montenegro didn't become queen because someone crowned her. She became queen the moment she chose herself, and everything else followed. So if you've ever felt small or lost or used, remember her, remember this, and remember that your voice might be the start of everything.